The house was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until even the softest sound feels too loud. I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the flicker of the fireplace tracing familiar shadows on the walls where old photographs hung like silent witnesses. Each frame told a story: my husband's smiling face, the proud faces of our children when they were young, the slow, steady pulse of a life once steady, now unsettled. It was strange how a place so full of memories felt so hollow all at once. I could hear their voices from the dining room, the words weaving through the house like ghosts. Michael's confident tone, always just a little too sharp. Clara's laughter, beneath which there was always a hint of something sharper, something calculated. I stayed where I was, an invisible observer in my own home, listening to them parse out the future of the company that had been built with the sweat and sacrifice of years. Yet I was summoned to the table only by obligation, as if my thoughts carried no weight in the matters of money and legacy. The air grew thick when Michael finally spoke, his words dropping like stones into the tense atmosphere. "Really, Mother, your ideas belong to a past that doesn't exist anymore. This is the future, and I'm the only one prepared to lead it." His voice wasn't raised, but the contempt bleeding through was unmistakable. I felt the room tilt, not in space, but in significance. I was no longer the matriarch, no longer the woman who had stood beside my husband, sharing secrets of business and comfort alike. I was reduced to a relic, a faded chapter best left closed. Clara's eyes sparkled as she chimed in, her words a dagger clothed in silk. "Honestly, Evelyn, isn't it time you accepted that your role here is diminishing? We all need to move forward, and that means stepping aside." The words hit me harder than any physical blow could. In that moment, I was not just seen as irrelevant, I was a burden, an obstacle to their desires. The silent dinner felt like a verdict pronounced without trial. I set down my fork, my hands trembling ever so slightly. Those around me did not notice, or perhaps they chose not to. I wanted to respond, to defend the years I had given, the sacrifices I silently bore. But instead, I swallowed the lump knotted in my throat and pushed the warmth of tears back into the shadows. For years, I had nurtured this family. For years, I had held our world together through quiet strength. And now, I sat as though I were invisible. A sudden wave of loneliness crashed over me. How had it come to this? Not just the dinner, the dismissive glances, or the absence of respect. It was the epicenter of betrayal, the knowledge that those I loved and helped raise regarded me as a fading figure, a mere ghost in the halls of the home we built. The pain burrowed deep, an ache that mixed with a flicker of something else, the cold seed of realization. In that silence, my mind drifted back to a moment from long ago, a memory vivid and unwavering. I was younger, standing beside my husband in the very study that held the weight of our legacy. He looked at me with a softness I rarely saw, his voice low and earnest. "Evelyn, these shares I hold, they represent more than money. They are the key to what we built, to the future I dreamed of for you and the family. Guard them well." At the time, I'd nodded quietly, never fully grasping the gravity of his words. But now, the memory was a beacon. The house around me, once so filled with love and laughter, now echoed with unspoken words and fractured alliances. The betrayal was not sudden. It had crept in over years, cloaked beneath smiles and polite conversations. Yet this evening carved it in stone. They truly believed my power was gone, that I was no longer a force to reckon with in the business we shared or in the family we held together. I closed my eyes and felt the weight settle on my chest, a burden I was all too familiar with but had never let define me. The role I once played, sitting quietly in the background, was no longer an option. Not because I sought to challenge them for the sake of conflict, but because survival demanded it. Because the silence I lived with, the patience I practiced, was about to give birth to something else, a strength they could neither see nor comprehend. The evening wound down, and the others retreated to their rooms, their footsteps light and unconcerned. I remained where I sat, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls, feeling the stinging quiet of tears behind my lids. But these tears were different, quieter, heavier, carved by disappointment and resolve in equal measure. They had underestimated me. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence harbored strength, and strength was exactly what I was beginning to awaken. The nights following that bitter dinner passed under a restless quiet, but the silence no longer carried sorrow. Instead, it held a simmering determination that stirred deep within me. I moved through the rooms of my home as if retracing the every step of my long life here. The years I had held this family together quietly, the sacrifices made in shadows and whispers. Each photograph and keepsake seemed to remind me of the countless moments I'd set aside my own needs for theirs. I thought of those countless times I had been physically present but truly unseen. I sat silently during meetings where my husband's legacy was discussed without me, my ideas dismissed or ignored. Michael's voice often filled the room, brimming with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Clara's carefully crafted smiles hid her calculating ambition. My contributions had been buried beneath their eager claims of ownership, as if my years of counsel were irrelevant. Yet anger did not wash over me in waves. Instead, beneath the ache, a calm clarity took hold. I realized that futile battles only deplete the soul. My strength came from patience, from observation, the elements I would use now more deliberately than ever. Unlike the reckless impatience of Michael or the sly power plays of Clara, I intended to act quietly and precisely. This would be my silent revenge. Night after night, memories played like a record in my mind. I recalled how often decisions had been made behind closed doors with no invitation for me to speak. I remembered the thinly veiled dismissals, the absence of my name when discussing crucial business matters. The betrayal was subtle but constant, a quiet erosion of my place in the family and company I had helped build. But I was no stranger to quiet resilience. My husband's voice echoed gently in my mind, recalling the moment years ago when he had confided in me about those shares he controlled. "Evelyn," he had said, "these shares are more than just numbers. They're the key to everything we've built. Guard them well, for they hold the future." At the time, I had nodded with little understanding of the burden or power those words held. Now, I clung to that memory like a lifeline. I spent hours reflecting on every slight and every dismissal, not with bitterness alone, but with growing resolve. The silence I had once accepted as my place now felt like a shield, the perfect cover to gather strength without alerting those who belittled me. I wasn't invisible. I had learned long ago that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits in the shadows, growing under the surface. In the days that followed, I committed myself to understanding the present state of the business, to uncovering the facts that Michael and Clara overlooked or deliberately ignored. I still recalled every strategy discussion with my husband, every detail of those ledgers and reports. My mind retraced the paths of decisions taken in my absence. Their reckless confidence had blinded them to risks I was now determined to expose. I began discreetly reaching out to a few trusted old contacts, people who had worked closely with my husband and who still remembered the true values that built our legacy. Their quiet support surprised me. They too had sensed the growing fragility of the company and welcomed a steady hand. I was no longer alone in my resolve. My days became a careful balance between watching, learning, and planning. I read through documents, contracts, and financial statements, my eyes sharp for signs of mismanagement, careless risks, and ill-advised deals. I saw how Michael's confidence sometimes bordered on careless, how Clara's ambition ignored prudent caution. The cracks in the foundation were becoming clear to me, even if hidden from their sight. At times, loneliness pressed hard. This was a silent battle waged in solitary spaces. But the solitude also sharpened me, honed my focus. Anger was a luxury I could not afford. Patience was my weapon. Every quiet hour spent in study was a step closer to reclaiming my place, a renewal of purpose rooted in justice and legacy. I envisioned the moment when I would no longer be sidelined, but central to decisions, not as a forgotten figure, but as a force that could no longer be ignored. My plan was to reveal not merely my ownership of the shares, but the depths of their missteps, to show how their arrogance blinded them to the dangers threatening everything we had built. They saw me as quiet, weak, and outdated. They failed to understand that beneath my silence was a strength sharpened by years of watching and waiting, that patience was not surrender, but preparation. As days turned into nights, the house transformed in my eyes. It was no longer just my home, but the command center of a carefully crafted plan, one that would restore order and respect to the family and the business. This was not about revenge born from bitterness, but about reclaiming what was mine, about honoring the legacy my husband entrusted to me. Late one evening, standing before the window, I looked out over the garden, a firm calm settling over me. The weight on my chest was still there, but it no longer crushed. Instead, it grounded me. I was ready to step from the shadows. The storm they had failed to see gathering beneath my silence was about to break. A faint, quiet smile curved my lips. They had underestimated me. They thought their dismissive words and actions had broken my spirit. But what they did not understand was this: silence was never weakness. It was a force, and in that force, something far stronger was born. The early mornings became my sanctuary, the quiet hours before the world awakened, allowing me to delve deeper into secrets long overlooked. I surrounded myself with paperwork, ledgers, contracts, letters folded over years, each one a thread in the tapestry of the family business that Michael and Clara had so recklessly claimed as their own. To them, these were mere bureaucratic details, distant and dull. To me, they were weapons and truths waiting to be wielded wisely. I reached out to Diane, my husband's trusted financial advisor and longtime friend. Diane was one of the few people who saw beyond appearances, who respected experience and loyalty above ambition. When I first called her, my voice was composed, quiet, but beneath each word lay an unspoken history. She recognized that voice instantly. "Evelyn," she said, her tone a blend of surprise and relief, "I wondered when you'd return." In Diane, I found an ally, a confidant skilled in the language of numbers and law, the pillars that would uphold my claim and dismantle their fragile confidence. We met at a small cafe nestled between aged townhouses, the smell of old wood and bitter coffee wrapping around us like a cloak of familiarity. I handed her a folder thick with the documents I had painstakingly gathered, laying out the mismanagement and recklessness that had eroded the company's foundation. Her eyes scanned each page with growing concern. "They're playing a dangerous game," Diane said, her voice low. "These expenses, the unauthorized contracts, they've already placed the company at risk." She looked up at me, her gaze steady. "What do you want to do?" I had thought about this question often, but hearing it from her, the decision crystallized. I wasn't here to question or hesitate. This was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine and protecting a legacy my son and daughter-in-law had jeopardized with their arrogance. I want to use what my husband entrusted to me, the shares, the control they think I lack, to bring order and justice. Diane nodded slowly. "We'll need a precise plan. Control over shares means power, but it requires careful execution. If they catch wind of anything premature, they'll tighten their grip." She smiled faintly. And in that smile, I found reassurance. "You've been underestimated, Evelyn. That always plays to your advantage." In the weeks that followed, our meetings grew frequent and urgent. Diane helped me navigate the labyrinth of corporate finance, shareholder agreements, and legal frameworks. I learned how the majority control granted by my shares could override the reckless decisions Michael and Clara had made. With this knowledge as our foundation, we built a strategy that was as much about timing as it was about force. While Diane handled the technical details, I continued to observe. I listened to my son's boastful claims, heard Clara's manipulative whispers, and noted every careless overreach. Their confidence was their weakness. They talked openly about expanding into risky markets, signing dubious deals without consulting me or seeking counsel. Their arrogance was blinding. Behind the scenes, I gathered evidence, a collection of reports, projections, and financial discrepancies that painted a clear picture of mismanagement. I cross-checked each fact, building an unassailable case that would leave no room for their dismissals or denials. This was not just about power, it was about accountability. Yet I remained cautious. I did not alert them to my activities. To them, I was still the quiet matriarch, the fading figure relegated to the sidelines. I knew this guise was my greatest strength. They believed I was powerless, and that belief blinded them to the truth I was crafting. I also reached out discreetly to other shareholders and board members, many of whom had grown wary of Michael's impulsive leadership and Clara's influence. Their silence was a shield for their fear, but with gentle persuasion, some began to question the direction the company was headed. I offered them a vision of stability and respect, a future where the family legacy would be safeguarded, not squandered. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Michael's financial decisions were reckless. He had approved high-risk loans without proper assessment, fascinated more by immediate gain than sustainable growth. Clara, meanwhile, had secretly funneled funds toward ventures that benefited her family's interests more than the business. Neither realized their errors, caught in the whirl of entitlement, blind to the consequences they invited. Night after night, I compiled my dossier. The work was meticulous, each page a testament to decades of quiet observation and growing resolve. I found in myself a resilience born not from bitterness, but from the necessity of protecting what mattered most. This was more than money or control. This was about preserving the foundation of everything I loved, my husband's memory, my family's future, and the home we built together. Occasionally, I felt the sting of loneliness. This journey was mine alone, walked in silent determination. No one knew the depth of my plans or the fire fueling them. Yet, in this solitude, I found strength. The patience that had once felt like resignation now became the wellspring of my power. Each quiet hour was a step toward justice. I pictured the day I would confront them, not with anger or confrontation, but armed with truths they could not deny. The day I would reveal the depth of their carelessness and remind them that the family's legacy was not a prize for entitlement, but a responsibility that demanded respect and wisdom. I imagined their shock when they learned I was not the defeated matriarch they believed, but the force quietly reshaping their world. The house itself seemed to mirror this quiet transformation. It was no longer a place from which I had retreated, but the nerve center of my plan. Every corner held memories and strategies, every room a space where I gathered strength and prepared for the inevitable. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees and cast long shadows through the window, I sat at my desk, the weight of the past years settling beside me. The burden of invisibility and dismissal had been heavy, but it no longer defined me. The path ahead was clear, and I was ready. They thought my silence meant surrender, but silence had been my shield and now became my sword. The time was near to step out of the shadows, to claim what had always been mine, not just as a matter of rights, but as a declaration of strength and justice. Their underestimation was their greatest mistake, and in that mistake lay my silent authority. The morning of the meeting dawned cool and clear, the air crisp with the promise of change. As I prepared for the day, the house felt different, charged, almost electric, as if the walls themselves anticipated the shift I was about to bring. Every moment was deliberate. I dressed in calm purpose, choosing garments suited not to command attention, but to convey quiet authority. There was strength in subtlety, and I would wield it like a blade. The drive to the office was filled with a strange mixture of memories and resolve. I thought of the countless times I had walked these streets after meetings that left me unheard, of dinners where my presence was tolerated but my insights dismissed. The sting of being sidelined lingered, but it had been tempered now by a deeper understanding of power's truest nature. This was not about confrontation or noise. It was about reclaiming what was mine with measured precision. Entering the building was like stepping onto a stage set long before I was meant to ascend. The familiar hum of activity buzzed around me, the chatter of employees, the distant clang of printers, the low murmur of telephones. But in my mind, the noise receded into silence. The conference room awaited, its polished wood and gleaming surfaces ready to reflect the turning point of this family's history. Greeting them was a study in contrasts. Michael arrived first, his gait confident, eyes bright with anticipation of dominance. Clara followed with her poised smile and carefully controlled demeanor, her gaze calculating as always. They saw me as they always had, the aging matriarch whose time was past, whose opinions were quaint relics of a bygone era. But I wore my quiet certainty like armor, and beneath it a storm was gathering. I commenced the meeting with a calm that unsettled them immediately. Thank you for joining me today. We have important matters to address, matters that affect not just the company's future, but the legacy it carries. My words were deliberate, each one falling like a measured stone in a still pond. The flickers of surprise in their expressions became cracks in their armor. I reached for the folder I had placed meticulously on the table. Sliding it toward the center, I said, "I have reviewed the financial reports and recent decisions. What I have found cannot be ignored." Watching them lean forward, eyes scanning the carefully compiled evidence, I saw confidence beginning to wane. Michael's fingers twitched. Clara's smile was slower to form. The reports revealed more than missteps. They exposed reckless loans made without due diligence, contracts signed in haste and secrecy, funds diverted to ventures lacking oversight. Their boldness had bred vulnerability, and I held the proof. Leadership, I continued, is not merely occupying a position. It demands responsibility, knowledge, and respect for what has been built. Their silence was telling. It was clear they recognized the severity, even if pride still kept their voices restrained. I sensed Clara's impatience rising. She was ready to challenge, to dismiss, but Michael's gaze faltered. The certainty in his eyes dimmed beneath the weight of facts. Then, slowly, I unveiled the ultimate revelation. "Despite your beliefs to the contrary," I said, letting the silence deepen between us, "I maintain control of the majority shares of this company." Their expressions froze. Michael's jaw tightened. Clara's composure flickered. I continued, voice steady. "These shares were entrusted to me not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a promise of stewardship, and I intend to fulfill that promise." The power in those words was not loud, but unmistakable, a declaration that shook the ground beneath their feet. Their initial shock gave way to disbelief. Michael's voice rose, tinged with frustration. "Mother, this is unexpected. We've been managing the company's affairs actively, making decisions for growth." His words, once confident, stumbled under scrutiny. I met his gaze without flinching. "Growth without caution is ruin. The decisions you've made have put us at risk. I'm here to correct that course." Clara interjected sharply. "You're stepping in too late, Evelyn. The family should move forward, not be anchored to the past." I shook my head softly. The past holds lessons, and the legacy we share demands respect. Moving forward recklessly is not progress, it is peril. The meeting stretched on, tensions thickening with each minute. They outlined the measures I would implement: a restructuring of decision-making processes, invoking veto powers to prevent unilateral risks, and establishing a governance framework that balanced ambition with prudence. Each statement was precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding or objection. Michael attempted resistance, his voice rising in argument, but I responded with facts. Clara's sharp retorts lost their edge under the weight of evidence. Their confidence crumbled as the reality of their overreach sank in. In that room, I was no longer the sidelined mother or the long-silent matriarch. I was the custodian of a legacy, the guardian of stability, and the bearer of a truth they could no longer deny. The shift was palpable. The room that had once echoed with their plans now absorbed a new rhythm, one dictated by quiet authority and measured strength. As the meeting drew to a close, I saw the reluctant acknowledgement in their eyes. There was no joy in this victory, only the sober acceptance that the family business would no longer be theirs to command unchecked. I gathered my documents, feeling the weight of history settle on my shoulders, but buoyed by the courage that had carried me here. Walking away from the conference room, I sensed the subtle transformation already unfolding: relationships recalibrated, respect restored, and the future realigned. The company, the family, and I were intertwined, each strengthened by the balance now restored. Returning home that evening, the house embraced me with a familiarity I had long missed. The quiet shadows were gentler now, as if sharing in the resolve that had awakened within me. The keys to the house and the business were symbols not merely of ownership, but of renewed purpose. In the solitude of my room, I allowed a quiet smile to surface. Not a smile of triumph over others, but of peace reclaimed and battles won through patience and wisdom. The journey from silence to authority was complete, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter. They had thought me broken, irrelevant, and powerless. They had misread the quiet strength I bore. Now, that strength was no longer hidden. It was the foundation upon which I would rebuild, not just the business, but the family, the home, and the legacy that had always been mine to protect. And as the night settled in, I knew with a deep certainty that the silence they once took for weakness had become the bedrock of my power. The days following that crucial meeting settled into a new rhythm, one marked less by overt confrontation and more by the slow, steady rebalancing of power. The air hung thick with a quiet tension that was palpable to those who walked the halls of the company. Michael's once unshakable confidence now bore the marks of uncertainty. Clara's practiced composure occasionally slipped, revealing glimpses of frustration beneath the surface. Both were learning that their reign, once seemingly unquestionable, was now subject to boundaries they had never bothered to anticipate. The next board meeting loomed, a gathering more consequential than any before. It was an opportunity for their ambitions to be challenged not by words alone, but by the full weight of my authority. Michael arrived with his usual presence, eyes bright and expectant, though nerves flickered at the edges. Clara followed with a poised smile, radiating calculated optimism, ready to sway opinion with charm and conviction. But beneath their facades was a growing awareness of the shift that had taken place. Their proposals were bold, plans to expand swiftly into new markets, aggressive investments poised to elevate the company's status but fraught with risk. To an outsider, it might have seemed vision. To me, it was reckless overconfidence threatening to unravel everything painstakingly built. I listened carefully, weighing each suggestion against the company's current strengths and vulnerabilities. When my moment came, I spoke softly but firmly. "These initiatives," I said, "pose risks that exceed what our company can shoulder at this critical moment." The room's temperature shifted, the assertiveness of my veto hanging like a decisive verdict. "Therefore, I am obliged to exercise my right to reject these plans." The impact was immediate. Michael's jaw tightened, eye contact faltering for the briefest of moments. Clara's gaze sharpened, a flash of annoyance flickering before she masked it with professionalism. Their surprise was visceral. Were these the same walls that had once echoed with their unchallenged ambitions? Now, those ambitions met a silent but unyielding barricade. Michael, never one to concede easily, pushed back. "Mother, I am convinced these expansions are necessary for our growth. The company must seize opportunity." I met his gaze steadily. "Growth without caution endangers everything. It blinds us to looming perils and threatens our survival." The calm certainty behind my words was unwavering, a shield forged from years of experience and observation. Clara's response was sharper, her voice laced with veiled reproach. "Your resistance halts progress at the altar of outdated caution. The family deserves a future shaped by bold steps, not tethered to the past." Yet even in her retort, the nerves betrayed her. The veto was real and enforceable. The rest of the board sat silently, absorbing the gravity of the moment. The power balance was no longer theoretical. It had been asserted clearly and legally. The family dynamic, once fractured through quiet resentment and resentment unspoken, began to find a tentative new equilibrium, uneven but undeniable. In the days that followed, a pattern emerged. Michael and Clara withdrew somewhat, their boisterous plans tempered by the invisible boundary my authority fostered. Their ambitions still flickered, but they now moved with caution, aware of the limits imposed by responsibility and oversight. The offices echoed less with whispered schemes and more with careful, measured conversations. I consulted regularly with trusted advisors, delving into financial reviews and strategic planning sessions that brought transparency and accountability previously missing. The company was slowly healing from reckless hands, nurtured now by steady and quiet stewardship. At home, the atmosphere mirrored this transformation. The walls held fewer tensions, shadows that once weighed heavily seemed softened by hope and resolve. Michael and Clara's presence was now marked by a cautious respect, even if unspoken, as they grappled with the shifting realities. In my quiet moments, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the journey. Loneliness lingered, yes, but it was tempered by the deep satisfaction of purpose reclaimed. Tears surfaced quietly, not of sorrow, but as a release of years spent in silence and sidelining. I recalled my husband's words and foresight. The legacy he entrusted to me was more than shares or contracts. It was the faith to protect family, to safeguard dreams, and to stand firm when others faltered. That duty now rested solely with me. Sometimes, when the burden lifted for a brief moment, a soft laugh escaped me, a laugh born of resilience and hard-earned wisdom. I had become the architect of renewal, not through loud declaration, but through steady, silent authority. They had misjudged my silence, mistaking patience for weakness. But from that silence, I had forged a strength they could not begin to comprehend. The company was no longer the playground of unchecked ambitions. It was a legacy rebuilt on respect and measured power. And as twilight settled over the house, I would sit quietly and reflect on the path I had traveled, from invisibility to undeniable force. The family I loved was imperfect, a tapestry woven with conflict and hurt, yet threaded with hope and endurance. My place was no longer at the edges, but at the heart, not as a forgotten figurehead, but as the steady hand guiding what mattered most. This was the silent authority I had claimed, the quiet triumph that marked a new beginning, and it was only the first step in the journey ahead. The days that followed were quieter in tone but profound in meaning. Michael and Clara, both defeated and bewildered, receded into the background, no longer the dominant force they imagined themselves to be. Their eyes, once sharp with entitlement, now held a veil of reluctant respect, the kind born not of affection but understanding the new reality etched before them. The family dynamic, tense and fractious for so long, began a slow transformation towards something more balanced, more honest. I stood alone in the company's conference room one evening, the space now calm and suffused with soft light. The weight of what had transpired settled around me like a cloak, not a burden, but a shield forged by years of patience and resolve. The power I now exercised was not driven by anger or spite, but tempered by the desire to protect what was sacred, the legacy my husband and I had built, the business that sustained us, and the family that needed healing. With each passing day, I took deliberate steps to transform the company into a reflection of the values I held dear: stability, responsibility, and respect. Meetings were no longer arenas of silent battles, but opportunities for dialogue grounded in accountability. I pushed for transparency, ensuring that decisions were backed by wisdom and prudence rather than impulse and ambition. At home, the air shifted too. The house that had once echoed with the quiet pain of invisible womanhood now felt more like a sanctuary. The tension that had clung like mist loosened its grip as family relationships, though still fragile, began to repair. Michael and Clara's retreat was palpable, their ambitions tempered by the realization that they no longer held unfettered control. With time, I sensed their grudging acceptance, not triumph, but a truce born of new boundaries. Walking through the rooms, I felt the faint stirrings of peace. The photographs that had once been silent witnesses to my fading role now seemed to share in my quiet triumph. Each corner, each shadow, spoke softly of endurance and renewal. The keys to the house and the business, once symbols of contention, now represented stewardship restored. In the stillness of the evening, I often reflected on the journey I had taken, from the abyss of invisibility to the heights of command. It was a path marked by tears unseen, sacrifices unacknowledged, and a strength that grew quietly beneath the surface. I had learned that silence was not submission, but a wellspring of power waiting for the right moment. The house breathed alongside me, alive with memories and new beginnings. I could feel the presence of my husband in the comfort of these walls, his faith in me echoing through the legacy left behind. I was no longer merely a custodian of material wealth, but a guardian of family and values. As I stood by the window one night, watching the moon cast its gentle light over the garden, a soft smile settled on my lips. The scars of betrayal and neglect remained, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders of battles fought and won through patience, wisdom, and unwavering resolve. They had underestimated me, assuming silence meant surrender. But that silence had borne strength, quiet, formidable, and enduring. It had nurtured a new beginning not just for me, but for the family and the business I held dear. The future was still unwritten, filled with both challenges and hope, yet I faced it with calm determination, secure in the knowledge that I had reclaimed what was mine, not through conflict, but through silent authority and steadfast heart. This was the dawn of the life I would lead, strong, quiet, and unyielding, a new chapter forged from the ashes of betrayal, ready to embrace justice, peace, and the enduring power of love.